The Civil War was a brutal time in American history. Brothers took up arms against one another to fight for what they and their state believed in. But what about the men who orchestrated the conflict? In this documentary, I, Trent Ferguson, and my partner Jimmy Martino will analyze the early life, the rise to prominence, the personalities, the beliefs, the military careers, the post-war life and legacy of the two most fascinating and influential generals of the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant.
An important general with a humble background, Ulysses S. Grant was a key figure both in the Civil War and the Reformation. Born on April 27, 1822, in Point Pleasant, Ohio, Ulysses S. Grant was the son of a high tanner, but both him and his father ultimately thought he could achieve more. Rather early on in Grant's childhood, he was found to be quite proficient at horsemanship, both in taming and riding. Grant's father, who wanted him to have a better future, applied Grant into the West Point Service Academy without his knowledge, and when Ulysses was ultimately accepted, his father told him that he was going.
A symbol of nobility, courage, and pride to some, while to others a symbol of slavery and oppression, Robert E. Lee was praised for his ability as a general, his strength, and his character. Born on January 19th of 1807 to a father who was a Revolutionary War hero known as Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, he attended college at West Point, New York, in the class of 1829. He graduated second in class without a single demerit in all 4 years. After his graduation, he served 17 years in the Corps of Engineers surveying national defense in the United States. He then fought in the Mexican-American War and showed his distinguished service to the country. He was promoted to the rank of colonel. In 1852 to 1855, he served as the superintendent for West Point, where he ended up training many men who would fight against him in battle. In 1855, he left his post as superintendent and joined a position in cavalry, where he ended up putting down John Brown's raid in 1859. During the trying times nearing the Civil War, Lincoln had offered Lee the position as the head of the Union Army, in which he declined. When Virginia seceded in 1861, after 32 years in the Army, Robert E. Lee decided to resign.
Prior to Grant's leadership in the Civil War, he had experienced conflict firsthand while serving in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. While serving in the Mexican-American War, Grant acted as his regiment's quartermaster, providing them with supplies and coordinating their overall transportation. While serving under General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott, Grant acquired many battlefield tactics. However, due to accusations of heavy drinking, Grant was forced to abruptly resign from his military service.
Robert E. Lee's personality did not fit the stereotypical idea of a wealthy Southern man in the South during the 1860s. Unlike many slave owners at the time, Lee believed the institution to be wrong. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, will acknowledge that slavery is an institution, is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages." He also wrote, however, that he believed blacks were immeasurably better off here than they were in Africa. He hoped that the institution of slavery would help prepare them and lead them to better things. Robert E. Lee was also very loyal to his state. In the letter to his old friend, he wrote, "If Virginia stands by the old Union, so will I. But if she secedes, though I do not believe in secession as a constitutional right, nor that there is sufficient cause for revolution, then I will follow my native state with my sword, and if need be, my life." Lee was also a very stoic individual in battle. He was known to be heated, but also strangely calm. One of his main tactics was to destroy the enemies and not let them escape battle. During his first field command, Lee had used these tactics, though he failed to hold back the Union troops. This led to him getting sent back to Richmond as a military advisor. A new field command position opened up when General Joseph E. Johnston was injured. Lee renamed Johnston's army to the Army of Northern Virginia. This army would end up being the most distinguished army of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Lee had decisive victories at Fredericksburg and Manassas, also known as the Second Bull Run. Then, he stayed on the defensive and had a decisive victory in Chancellorsville. This was his most renowned victory, as he only had a small portion of the army with him, and he sent the main forces out to flank while he only left himself with 2 divisions against an entire army. Sadly, his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, had died during this battle. He famously said to Stonewall Jackson, You have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right." He then moved back to Richmond, where he had fought on the defensive. After repelling many successful attacks, Lee had understood that the only way to win a war against the Union was to push into their territory. With the confidence in his army, he had moved to attack Gettysburg. Unfortunately for Lee, General George McClellan had found plans of the advance in their old encampment. During the Battle of Gettysburg, many lives were lost. Lee decided that one decisive movement, a charge against the front lines of the Union Army, would end up winning the battle for the Confederacy. During this charge, Lee had failed to realize that the Union rifle had made these charges nearly impossible. The charge had failed, with the Confederate Army losing many men, and also the battle. After this shameful defeat, Robert E. Lee sent in a resignation letter to Jefferson Davis, which Davis had declined. Lee understood he was fighting a losing battle against Ulysses S. Grant, who kept pushing further and further down into the South. While Lee could make Grant pay in a toll of bodies, the Confederacy's defeat was inevitable. On April 9, 1865, after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to the Union troops, where they were gracefully pardoned and allowed to go home to their farmsteads.
Following the breakout of the Civil War, Grant immediately looked to re-enlist. However, generals were wary of putting him back into power following his abrupt resignation and accusations of heavy drinking. When the war broke out, Grant was first appointed the leader of the unruly Volunteer Regiment of Illinois. His regiment of roughly 3,000 men, along with naval support, captured the Confederate strongholds of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. This victory was his first major engagement, earning him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, and got him promoted to Major General. Grant often rode his horse through the front lines in order to stir up hope in his battle-weary troops. Grant was often criticized for his military tactics, as they often led to numerous casualties. The Battle of Shiloh was known as the bloodiest battle ever fought in America up to that time. The 17,000 Union and Confederate casualties of the two-day battle stunned the people of the North. During a 6-week campaign, nicknamed the Overlord Campaign, resulted from such high casualties for the Union Army that Grant was nicknamed the Butcher. The amount of casualties in both of these battles caused the general public to question Grant's leadership abilities. However, Lincoln stood by his general, saying, "Grant is my man, and I am his." Some of Grant's more notable victories, besides the Appomattox campaign, included the Battle of Vicksburg, where on July 3, 1863, his army surrounded and captured 30,000 Confederate troops. Grant was also responsible for the rescue of the besieged Union forces at Chattanooga, who were stuck in a low valley surrounded by Confederate forces. He shuttled supplies through dense woodlands for the stranded and starving Union troops and led a charge up Missionary Ridge, ultimately providing a Union victory. Grant was engaged in a total of 7 major battles during the Civil War. These battles were the Battle of Shiloh, the Siege of Vicksburg, the Chattanooga Campaign, the Overland Campaign, Siege of Petersburg, the Appomattox Campaign, and the Battle of Fort Donelson. Grant was responsible for drawing the Civil War to a close due to his surrounding of Confederate forces on April 9, 1865. General Lee formally surrendered to Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. Immediately following the Civil War, Grant was seen as a hero, and, due to his military success, he was elected the 18th President of the United States. Despite Grant being a generally honest man, Grant's presidency was plagued with corruption. After an investigation found he was not involved directly with any scandals, he was re-elected to a second term of the presidency. However, by the end of his second term, he was resented by both political parties. Following a series of failed business ventures by Grant's son, Grant looked to provide financial security for his family after he was gone. With the help of his friend Mark Twain, Grant published memoirs about his life and his role in the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant died on July 23, 1885.
After his surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee returned to his house on parole. He became the president of Washington University in Lexington, Virginia, until he died on October 12, 1870, of heart disease. His last words were "strike the tent," which symbolizes moving on to the afterlife. His body is interred in Washington University's chapel, in which thousands of Southerners came to see his funeral. Robert E. Lee's legacy is one of the most famous in American history. He became an icon of the South, of the Southern noble, or gentleman, and represented the spirit of the Southern way of life. After his death, Washington University in Lexington, Virginia, renamed itself to Washington and Lee University in honor of his name.
Grant is generally seen today in regard to the problems concerning his presidency, not through his crucial role in the Civil War. However, if the focus were to be placed upon his leadership in the war, he would be seen as a hero, his role vital to not only the end of the Civil War, but also the later abolition of slavery. Despite their opposing viewpoints, General Ulysses Grant and General Robert E. Lee played vital roles in a turning point of our nation's history. Both the legacy of their actions and their effect on the nation